Something important is happening in Washington, and I think a lot of people are looking at these recent removals from Trump's orbit and asking the same question. Are we seeing the beginning of a broader purge inside this administration? Or is this just another episode in a presidency that has always run on chaos? With figures like Kristi Noem being pushed aside into what looks like a meaningless holding role, and Pam Bondi also out, it is tempting to treat this like some major turning point. But the truth is, with Trump, personnel shakeups are not the exception. They are the pattern. And that is really where the story begins. The instinct is to ask whether these firings signal a new strategy, a new direction, or some kind of internal correction. I don't think that is the right way to read it.
The more useful lens is much simpler. Trump has always preferred loyalty over competence, flattery over expertise, and personal obedience over independent judgment. That has been true from the beginning, and it is even more true now. Think back to his first time in office. He entered Washington in a position he did not fully expect to be in. He had not built out a real governing bench ahead of time, so the Republican establishment stepped in and helped populate the administration with people drawn from the broader conservative policy world. Some of them were mainstream Republicans, some had actual experience, some brought institutional knowledge, and some at least understood how government works. But what happened after that was telling. One by one, many of those people were either pushed out, forced out, or publicly humiliated on the way out. By the time that first administration played itself through, Trump had burned through top officials at a pace that was historically absurd. Why? Because skilled people tend to do something Trump dislikes. They bring facts into the room, they explain consequences, they answer questions with real information, not applause. And whenever that happened, it created friction. If someone understood an issue better than he did, then in his mind they were no longer useful. They were a threat to the image he wants to maintain around himself. So over time, he learned the lesson he preferred. Don't appoint people who know too much, appoint people who know what to say. That shaped what came next. During the years out of office, Trump didn't just tighten his grip on the Republican Party politically, he also hollowed it out institutionally. The policy minds, the recruitment pipelines, the governing talent networks, the people who once gave the party a reservoir of expertise, much of that either got sidelined, driven off, or rendered irrelevant. So when he came back for another term, the bench was weaker, thinner, and more ideologically warped than before. In many cases, there simply was no serious governing class left to draw from. What remained were loyalists, showmen, ideologues, and people whose chief qualification was that they would never challenge him in public or private.
That is why the current cabinet looks the way it does. And it also explains something else people keep missing. When a dysfunctional figure inside this administration comes under pressure, the natural public reaction is to say, good, maybe they'll be replaced by someone better. But that assumes the person was hired to perform well in the first place. In many cases, they were selected for the opposite reason. They were chosen because they would not overshadow the president, would not assert independent power, and would not create a rival center of credibility. Incompetence is not some accidental side effect here. It is often part of the design. You can see that in the vacancy map across government. More than 1,000 senior positions remain open. Posts that matter deeply, including major diplomatic and health-related roles, are still sitting unfilled. That is not just disorganization. Some of it is structural.
Empty roles cannot produce dissent. Weak institutions cannot resist a leader who wants personal control. So when people start making lists of who might be next on the chopping block, it is worth remembering that the story is not really about whether these people deserve to go. Many of them clearly do. The deeper issue is that there is no evidence the next round would be better. If anything, it could be worse, because the pool gets shallower every time. Take Howard Lutnick at Commerce. In financial circles, especially in New York, his reputation has long been toxic. There are people who have spent years around high finance who describe him not simply as aggressive or hard-nosed, but as someone whose name is routinely associated with corruption and transactional politics. In a different administration, that might be disqualifying. In this one, it almost reads like a resume highlight, and what has happened at Commerce tracks with that image. Tariff policy under Trump has become a rolling mess of reversals, exemptions, threats, pauses, carve-outs, and sudden changes. Businesses cannot plan when the rules keep moving. Manufacturers cannot invest confidently when the price environment changes every few days. Construction tied to industrial expansion has been falling for over a year, and once you strip out artificial support from data center spending, the broader picture looks even worse. But in a climate like that, disorder becomes a market of its own. If exemptions are valuable and policy is unstable, then access becomes a commodity. That is where the accusations around Lutnick become especially damaging. The picture that has emerged is one where connections matter and influence itself becomes a form of currency. Trump does not appear especially troubled by that. What may actually endanger Lutnick is not the corruption angle, not the harm to business confidence, and not the economic drag. The greater threat may be the way older social and political associations continue to create baggage around him, especially when those associations keep pulling Trump back into controversies he would rather have buried.
Then there is Robert F. Kennedy Jr. running Health and Human Services. And this one is extraordinary for a different reason. Here you have someone placed in charge of an enormous public health apparatus while openly pushing claims and instincts that undercut the foundations of modern medicine. Vaccine skepticism, pseudoscientific talking points, fringe dietary cures, anti-establishment performance politics dressed up as truth-telling. All of it feeds directly into decisions parents make for their children, communities make about disease prevention, and institutions make about long-term health policy. These are not abstract debates. They have real consequences that can echo for years. And yet that alone does not seem to be what bothers Trump. What bothers him is airtime. Kennedy creates his own orbit. He attracts headlines.
He energizes a separate faction. Make America healthy again. May overlap with Trump politically, but it still operates like its own brand, and Trump has never been comfortable sharing the spotlight for long. That matters because in this administration, becoming too visible can be almost as dangerous as being incompetent. The Surgeon General vacancy tells a similar story. 14 months in, one of the most important public-facing medical posts in government is still unresolved, and the only serious move attached to it so far has been someone widely dismissed as unserious. That is not just neglect, it is decay. Tulsi Gabbard represents another variation of the same pattern. For years, she has carved out a profile built around contrarian foreign policy positions that again and again seem to land on the side of America stepping back while adversarial powers benefit. Now she is in a role where information control matters enormously. The person who shapes the flow of intelligence shapes the president's view of the world. If that person is filtering, narrowing, or editorializing what reaches the Oval Office, then the presidency itself starts operating through distortion. But even that is not necessarily the problem in Trump's eyes. The real rupture appears to be Iran. When Gabbard stated publicly that there was no meaningful evidence Iran had suddenly moved closer to an operational bomb than it had been in previous years, she said something grounded enough to create friction with a White House that increasingly wants a more aggressive justification for confrontation. In other words, the issue was not that she was wrong, it was that she was inconvenient. And in Trump's world, inconvenient truths are often treated as acts of disloyalty. Kash Patel at the FBI is another example of what happens when grievance replaces governance. Patel arrived with almost no relevant law enforcement background, but with a strong record of conspiracy-minded rhetoric and ideological performance. That alone should have raised alarm bells. Once in office, the damage appears to have come quickly. Resources were reportedly shifted away from serious investigative priorities and redirected toward political optics and lower value enforcement activity. Training capacity has been weakened. Institutional focus has been blurred. The long-term cost of that kind of disruption is huge, because federal law enforcement depends on continuity, professional culture, and skill development over time. Yet again, the flaw from Trump's perspective is not incompetence in the ordinary sense. The flaw is failure to deliver personal vengeance. If Trump wants enemies investigated, publicly embarrassed, or criminally charged, and the evidence is not there, the official assigned to carry out that mission enters dangerous territory. That seems to have been part of the dynamic with Pam Bondi as well. If a case does not exist, you can slow walk it, posture around it, or try to create political theater out of it, but eventually reality catches up. And when it does, Trump's frustration tends to fall on the person who could not bend the system far enough.
Then we get to Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon, which may be one of the clearest illustrations of symbolic politics consuming actual state capacity. Hegseth essentially advertised his own lack of qualification, and somehow that was not a warning sign, but a selling point. Since taking over, he has struggled even with the basic architecture of administration. High-level coordination has lagged. Staff structures remain incomplete. Processes that should be boring and routine have become politicized. Promotions have become ideological battlegrounds. Training systems have been disrupted. Internal tensions have escalated because military institutions function best when competence, not culture war theater, drives decision-making. And then there is the rhetoric. The use of civilizational, crusader-style language around the Iran conflict is not just inflammatory, it is also revealing.
It suggests a performative vision of war, one aimed more at identity politics than strategic management. That is a dangerous mindset inside any defense apparatus. Opposition has come not only from within government, but from unexpected moral voices as well, including religious authorities disturbed by how faith-coded language is being folded into state violence. Still, Trump's likely issue with Hegseth is less about the institutional wreckage and more about optics. If the Iran war is not unfolding the way he hoped, then someone has to absorb blame. Hegseth is vulnerable precisely because he is visible, and in a White House built around personal image management, visibility without success is a fatal combination. Some of the personnel moves around the Defense Department lately even look like preemptive survival tactics, with potential rivals pushed aside before the top spot becomes shaky. So yes, many of these figures could be removed. But that does not mean the system would self-correct. That is the mistake people keep making. They are treating this like a normal administration in which bad appointments can be replaced by better ones after a period of embarrassment. That model no longer applies. The deeper mechanism has changed. I have seen a version of that shift outside government too. In business conferences, policy forums, and geopolitical events around the country, there used to be a predictable balance. You would have voices from different ideological camps, and even when they disagreed, each side would usually send people with some intellectual framework, some grounding in data, some institutional credibility. That has been falling apart. In room after room, what you now find is that very few serious people in business, academia, or strategic studies are willing to openly defend what this administration is doing. Not because they all suddenly became liberals, and not because political disagreement disappeared, but because the governing philosophy on display is untethered from the kind of evidence-based reasoning professionals usually rely on. That matters a lot, especially for the Republican coalition. For decades, the business community formed one of the central pillars of the party. Corporate America, investors, industry groups, donors, and economic conservatives all helped shape Republican identity. But many of those people now seem to be realizing that they are no longer steering the vehicle. They are strapped into the passenger seat while someone else jerks the wheel. And once that realization sinks in, the relationship changes. Quiet skepticism turns into distance. Distance turns into withdrawal.
That growing distance may also be part of why some Republican senators, at least a few, have started showing signs of hesitation. Not moral clarity, not exactly courage, but concern. Concern that Trump is becoming a drag not only on the country, but on the party's future and their own survival within it. Even that shift, though, may have arrived too late. Confirmation momentum has slowed. Appetite for rubber stamping new chaos appears weaker than it was. If a major slate of replacements were sent up tomorrow, new leadership at Defense, Justice, the FBI, Health and Human Services all at once, there is no reason to assume Congress would move quickly or move at all. And even if it did, where are the better names coming from? That is the central problem. The people who might once have filled those roles with some degree of seriousness are either gone, discredited within Trump's movement, unwilling to serve, or politically toxic to the base.
The pipeline is damaged, the bench is thin, the selection criteria are broken, so the likely outcome is not renewal. It is more drift, more improvisation, more contradiction, more delays, and more people occupying roles they are not remotely prepared to handle. You can already see the stress building around Trump himself. Since the Iran conflict escalated, his public appearances have carried more visible irritation, more volatility, more signs that events are not moving according to script. That would be hard enough for any president, but it is even more destabilizing for one who relies so heavily on control, dominance, and the performance of certainty. And then there is the internal management issue. Susie Wiles has often been described as one of the few people around Trump capable of translating his impulses into something like political discipline. If her illness has reduced her ability to play that role, the effect inside the White House could be enormous. Remove the person who acts as translator, buffer, and restraining force, and what is left is a much more direct relationship between Trump's moods and the machinery of government. That is not a stabilizing development, it is the opposite. So when people ask whether these firings matter, the answer is yes, but not in the simplistic sense. They matter not because they prove Trump is suddenly cleaning house, and not because they suggest better governance is around the corner. They matter because they reveal a system eating itself. A president who built a team around obedience is now frustrated that obedience does not automatically produce competence. A party that sacrificed its governing capacity for personal loyalty is discovering that loyalty cannot run a state, and a country that keeps waiting for the adults to return to the room is confronting the possibility that the room was emptied on purpose. That is why this moment feels darker than a routine political shakeup. This is not just dysfunction anymore. It is a leadership structure that cannot solve the problems it is creating, staffed by people selected for the wrong reasons, operating inside institutions that have been deliberately weakened. And when that kind of system starts to strain under pressure, it rarely gets cleaner before it gets uglier. Right now, that is the direction this appears to be heading.